Welcome to In Conversation, the incredible and very, very funny Alan Davies.
Barely credible, certainly.
We do live in interesting times, particularly if you're involved in stand-up comedy. But Boris Johnson wasn't available, so Alan has kindly filled in.
He'll be so available in a minute, don't worry about that. At the moment, though, I don't really know what job he'll get. He's been through the rigour for the next 60 weeks. If he's in number 10, really, it's the biggest practical joke that's ever been played. So I'm trying to sit like Rory Stewart. I want to sit like Rory Stewart. I don't know, he sat through the whole thing like a silverback gorilla, but without the bill. He was going to go. Wasn't he sit like that on a funny stool? Sorry, I'm not letting them see you, Mr. Esler.
Shall we get started? Or do you,
Absolutely, far away.
Right. He's an alumnus from the University of Kent.
It's true.
And
unbelievable, isn't it?
He
got 2-1.
He's come back to tell us how much he enjoyed it. No, you first trod the boards here, didn't you?
Yes, I was here in 1984. I started, and I was doing a drama degree. And my father said, "What sort of job are you going to get with that?" And I thought, well, hopefully no job at all. The point of doing a drama degree is to not have a job. And I wanted to do comedy, but no one else did. So that was a handicap. But you did plays here right from the start, because the fourth years who did a directing specialty cast their plays from first and second years, because third years were doing their final exams. So whether you liked it or not, you'd find yourself. And also the Dramatic Society would put plays on here a couple of times a term, and then you'd get involved somehow. So I've done the lights up there, and I always remember being up there and banging my head on the grid and really nearly knocking myself out, with people being very impatient down here about not focusing and burning my hands on barn doors. And once I did a play. Once I did a play, yeah. Pardon, say again?
You did painting.
Oh, yeah, we painted massive swastikas out the... huge swastikas, because we did Fear and Misery of the Third Reich, which really was... Our production of Fear and Misery of the Third Reich took it to new levels of misery. And we did a play here where the set was supposed to advance, get smaller and smaller and smaller. It's called The Empire Builders, as the family went up through the house and they were escaping this terrible noise, all very surreal. So it was cardboard boxes. And so they moved the cardboard boxes. And it was a good idea, except at the end, we had to crawl through a hole into the smallest room in the house. And my costume caught and the whole lot came down. And my friend Richard, who's one of the funniest people I've ever met in my life, was a stagehand, and he was just standing. At first he didn't even notice that it had all gone over, and then all the audience could see him, and oh God.
This must be a tradition, because I had a friend who was playing the madam in The Maids, the Jean Genet play, and you know the big entrance where she comes at the top of the stairs, and she's very, very glamorous, and she's got this long dress. Unfortunately, the long dress caught on the top bit of the stairs, and as she's walking down, this very large bit of wood followed her. Clunk, 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 clunk. Was that preparing you for a life of stand-up and other things?
Well, I did do stand-up while I was here, but not in here. I came back here in about 95 and did my show that I'd done at the Edinburgh Fringe year before. It's a huge acclaim going. But my stand-up debut was at the Whitstable Labour Club, which is...
When was that?
That was in 1988, and in those days, it used to be under the railway bridge in Whitstable.
I think we've got some...
There's a bit of murmuring. Well, now it moved, right? It moved up the road a bit, didn't it? But it used to be right under the bridge, and that's now a Whistle Stop Cafe, or so I don't know what it is. It's heartbreaking. Well, there are no students can afford to live in the place anyway.
In Whitstable?
In Whitstable, that was where we all
lived.
lived.
I lived in Whitstable, yeah.
I loved it.
But 1988, that was Labour the Wilderness years, wasn't it?
Yeah. All the jokes were about Margaret Thatcher. You had to have something in your set.
And that would get, yeah.
But in those days, you know, we were very active comparatively. I mean, C&D was very active. And believe it or not, there had to be an anti-apartheid movement It was a minority voice in the United Kingdom to be opposed to apartheid in South Africa. It wasn't a view shared by our government, who was happy to have Nelson Mandela in jail. We renamed the Student Union building the Nelson Mandela building, and that helped a great deal, I think, in getting him released finally.
Yes, the Afrikaners were trembling at that thought. You occupied various parts of university property, like most students.
The registry, we occupied the registry.
It was a nice place to occupy, wasn't it?
I was trying to get off with Julie Carlisle, to be honest with you. And she wasn't interested. And years later, she told me it's because my trainers had Velcro fastening. I mean, I'd have burned those trainers in a heartbeat if I'd known it was about the Velcro fastening.
Oh, yeah,
Maybe these would have
really cleaned up your act, oh.
But I can't remember why we occupied it, but we did. We were most annoyed because there was a security camera on top of the library, and someone noticed on day 2 that it had been turned and pointed at us. And imagine now, in the world we live in now, that we were so mortified and furious about surveillance. That was the only surveillance camera in Kent.
When you did your first stand-up, did you think you were any good? Were you any good?
Well, the good thing about stand-up is you know immediately by the noise or lack of noise. And I had talked a lot about how in Whitstable at that time there were no cash points, which was a constant source of grief because a lot of cheques were cashed in pubs in Whitstable in the 80s for £1.50. And there used to be a Dylan's bookshop on campus, and everybody stole books from Dylan's bookshop, and we thought Dylan's must be stealing the books themselves from somewhere else. And so it was a lot of talk, my first set, about things like that I'd made people laugh about already in the Neptune or wherever we went for a drink. And so I was talking about doing comedy, and some stand-ups came here and did a show in Elliot JCR. And I thought, maybe I could do this, you know. And a bunch of us went up with a play up to the Edinburgh Fringe in '86, and I saw Rory Bremner, and he was just so funny. It was ridiculous, you know. And I thought, this could be it. This could be the thing. Maybe we could do something like this. And I had some friends in a band, and they were doing a benefit to the Labour Club for Amnesty. And they put my name on the bill. They put my name on the poster without asking me. So we put your name on the poster, you've got to do your comedy. So I did.
And how do you go about it? I mean, do you write things down? Do you keep it on your head? How did you stand in front of the mirror, seeing
I did early on stand in front of the mirror with a broom handle, pretending it was a microphone. I didn't take the microphone out because my hands were shaking so much. And then a couple of years later, I remember doing a gig in Balham at the Balham Banana Cabaret, which is still running. And I was walking about on this kind of makeshift stage, and the microphone was shaking, and it was affecting the sound, so I had to take it out. And then when I started walking around, people laughed more, which initially I was a bit put out by. But then I found that actually being funny physically is a good thing. But I did, in those early days, I would just stand and go very, very fast, try and say all the things I'd thought of as quickly as possible and go off.
I noticed, I actually did some research. It may not look like it.
It's not what journalists do.
It's not what journalists do. I know, I'd never get a column on Daily Telegraph.
They just go on Twitter, see what's been said.
You started out in 1988, the Whitstable Labour Club. You were named Time Out Best Young Comic in 1991. You got the Critics Award for Comedy at the Edinburgh Festival in 1994. That seems quite fast to me.
Yeah, it's all downhill from there.
Yeah, was that you peaked?
I peaked in 1994. I got a Critics Award for Comedy at the Edinburgh Fringe. I was quite blasé about it. I was sharing a flat with Armstrong and Miller. They weren't selling any tickets, they were livid. It was hilarious. And I put it in the toilet. I rarely laughed as much as I did in that 3 weeks sharing a flat with those two. They're two of the nicest people.
You're suggesting it's a little bit competitive.
A little bit. Well, they weren't competitive with me, though, because they were a double act. They were competitive with Parsons and Naylor. They're hated rivals. And they were all Oxbridge boys, and they couldn't bear it. Parsons and Naylor were much funnier and selling a lot more tickets. Armstrong and Miller did overtake them. But I got that prize, and I thought, obviously this is the first of many, and I've never had another prize since. I missed out on the Perrier Award. It was supposed to be me and Harry Hill who were vying for it, and neither of us got it. And it turned out that the jury was split, and they added up all the second votes, and these are two Australian guys called Leno and Woodley won the prize. And they became good friends of mine, and I went out to stay. I said this on QI actually. We went out to stay with Colin Lane in Australia, and he put the Perrier Award on the bedside table. And I thought that was going to be mine, but no. Since then, I've been award-free, which is good because it makes a lot of shelf space and cabinet space.
It sounds like karma when you put the award on the shelf. I mean, you did it to others, so
yes,
yeah,
exactly. It's the sort of people we are.
Did Jonathan Creek and the other things you do? I mean, you've got a huge Leave Area career, and we'll get into QI in a minute. But I mean, did you ever think you'd just like to do it all? You just like to be on the stage? You just like to do? You obviously just don't like to do one thing.
No, I always wanted to act, and I wanted to act from the get-go, and it's quite difficult to do. I didn't go to drama school. I walked stupidly, and I've got a lisp. Disaster combination. But fortunately, David Renwick and Susie Belbin. David Renwick was the writer and creator of Jonathan Creek, and Susie Belbin is his producer, produced for years all his One Foot in the Graves. And in '95, they were looking for someone to play Jonathan Creek. And Nicholas Lyndhurst had said no, and Hugh Laurie had said yes and then no. And then they auditioned 38 people. and it was the 90s, so they auditioned 38 white men, obviously. And so I got in as the 38th white man to be auditioned. And it was my big break. It was really, it was a huge deal. And in those days, you'd get 12 million viewers on a Saturday night. So then I'd go down to the Comedy Store, my old sort of stomping ground, as it were, though I'd only been performing there for 5 years. And people would say to me, "What's this thing you're doing? My mum says it's good." Because they're all gigging at the weekends, and their parents are saying, "Oh, there's a very good show on at the moment by the man who did One Foot in the Graves. It's got the Caroline Quince in it. You should have a look at that." Didn't know it would run and run.
And well, Run and Run, QI. 18, is it 18 series?
Yes, that sounds right. They're here, some of the QI ones, they're here tonight.
QI Elf, is it?
We started in 2002. The pilot was before. Was the pilot 2002? Yes. They're not going to say.
They're not being very helpful, are they?
What happened was, I got offered commercials for the Abbey National, and I'd always said to my agent, it was an old school showbiz agent, and I remember going, they said, we'd like to represent you, would you come in? And I went in, and I was sitting in reception, and the receptionist said, picked up the phone and pressed the button and said, "Ronnie Corbett on 3." And as soon as she said Ronnie Corbett on 3, I thought, Ronnie Corbett's agent is in here. And then they introduced me to Tony Hancock, who's obviously long since passed away, but Tony Hancock's agent. And I suddenly felt like I was in the showbiz establishment. But what they want you to do is commercials and pantomimes in the summer seasons. They don't want you to do anything else. That's where all the wonga is. And the people who make the wonga from those things are the agents, the agents and the promoters. So Cannon and Ball, when they did 16 weeks, sold out in a 3,000-seat theatre in Blackpool, were getting 800 quid cash in an envelope a week each. And the takings were staggering. But that's what these guys want you to do.
Right.
And when I did tour in the 90s twice, they did rip me off. They ripped me off nicely. I got very nice round numbers came through, and I'd say, well, surely I know for a fact that we had 450 people in Bristol. That's that amount of money from that gig alone. And I said, I want to see the box office returns, and they said, oh, you won't get them. So anyway, that's where I was. That's where I can't remember. What I
You're quite grumpy.
Now, Gavin.
Well, we're trying.
I was furious about that.
I quite like it when you're grumpy. But I mean, that sounds like a pretty nasty business, doesn't it? I mean, you're the talent. You're up every night.
Well, but what it did mean was I was sort of naive about it. I said, I don't want to do adverts. And they said, what if we can get you a really big deal? And I said, come back to me when you've got me £1 million. And he came back and he said, I got you a 3-year deal with the Abbey National for £975,000. And I said, you have not. And that really threw me. That was so much money. It wasn't guaranteed because they were going to do 1 year. They had the option to pull out at any time. But the first year was 300 grand or something, right? So this is 5 times what I'd get for that Jonathan Creek series. It was for about 6 days' work. I couldn't, holy shit. So as my old friend John Lloyd, who's here tonight, said to me, he used the phrase, we took the shilling. We took the shilling when it came. And the upside of those ads was I met John. John directed all of those commercials. We made ads for the Abbey National for 4 years. Some of them were really, really funny, and we worked hard to make them funny in the face of all kinds of opposition.
From Abbey National.
And while we were making those ads, which we did them from 97 to 2001, John came to me one day and said, I've got an idea for a quiz show where you get points for being interesting. And I always liked the shows where you could be a bit discursive, where you didn't have a list of gags prepared in advance that you kind of crowbar in. There's nothing wrong with good gag writing, a good gag delivery. That's, it's great, but that's not what I do, really. I like to be off the cuff. I like to tell stories, and I like it to be a bit of a mess, because something comes out of that. Right? But if everything's all set up and you just say what you're prepared to say, nothing happens really in the room. And John was of a similar point of view, and so he said, well, I'm glad you said that, because not many people seem to think it's a good idea. I said, well, I think it's a really good idea. So he said, will you do the pilot? I said, I certainly will do the pilot. We did the pilot. And then we came to do a series, and he said, I thought there'd be 2 team captains. He said, I'm going to have you as the only regular. And I felt a bit of pressure on there, right? So I've got to be funny every week, no matter what, no matter who's there. And Stephen's in the chair, and he's formidable. He's frightening. I mean, he was actually frightening in those days. We became good friends, and we are good friends. But I mean, he would just bollock me. I mean, he would just absolutely say, you're boring and talking shit, you're uneducated. I mean, really, not reading not very much between the lines. Christ, who are you? This guy. I was sitting there. The panel didn't know what was going on. They couldn't understand any of the questions. They couldn't get any of the answers right. Clive Anderson would get really annoyed. The audience, none of them had seen QI, right? In the second series, I remember Stephen going, has anyone seen QI? And about 4 people put their hands up. Now they queue around the block to see QI, and Sandy comes out at the beginning, and they're all cheering, and they absolutely love QI. And that's been one of the great, joys of my working life, is how I've been very, very lucky, because Jonathan Creek and QI are both greatly loved by the people who watch it.
Yeah, but you put your finger on something. If by the second series most people hadn't seen it, how come you got the second series? What was the magical ingredient that led people to with the money?
Question. I mean, most shows got a second chance usually, unless they were really shit. And John was a really very important figure, and still is, of course, in comedy, and he hadn't done a show for a long time. Stephen was, it's hard to believe now, because QI is ubiquitous, but to get Stephen on every week in something was he rarely appeared on television. He'd turn up in his own show doing sketches, or he'd turn up in Blackadder, being a hilarious general, but you didn't often see Stephen. You might turn up on a chat show sometimes. So to have him in the chair, just being off the cuff and being Stephen, for all the fact that he quite often sounds like he knows everything, but he's actually wrong, was a real coup. And I think we were always a shoo-in for a second series, actually, if we didn't mess up the first series.
I want to throw it open to questions in a minute, but how heavily edited is it? Because I have this vague suspicion that you might say things that they might want to take out for legal reasons.
We've done so many jokes about masturbation and the royal family that when we finally become a republic, it's going to be the best-selling
Have you got the off-cuts somewhere?
DVD. Someone ought to be keeping those, because the shit could really hit the fan in that family. The Queen is holding it together, isn't she? There's no doubt about that.
Yeah, but moving on swiftly from that particular area, but how much do you record?
We record about 2 hours
and
for half an hour.
Yeah, and do you feel we've got it? Do you know that bit, that was really quite funny, that bit was funny, but they're not going to use it for some reason of taste?
Yeah, there's a bit of that. there's so much research done. The research team worked for months and months and months. There's so much stuff in the show that if you've got 4 or half people with half a brain in their head, if they can't think of something, if it doesn't stimulate some conversation or some remark or something, there's so many pictures to talk about, there's so many odd facts, there's so much personal enmity between people usually, that really there's so much to work from.
Yeah.
That there's always half an hour in there, and nowadays they do an Excel, which is 45 minutes. The thing about it is, I remember nothing of it. I mean, I had nothing, and when the show comes out, which is normally 6 or 10 months later, I think, I don't remember this happening at all. God, I can't remember. I meet people who I think have been on QI, but they haven't. I meet people who've been on QI often, but I don't remember. And then, but more than once, it's happened to me where I've been sitting at home and they've said something, and I've sat at home, sort of mouthed what I would say, and then I say it on the screen. And isn't that weird? Tragically, my brain really does only have about 4 paths, and the QI research team producers know exactly what they are.
And how to trigger it.
And how to trigger it. They spend a lot of time, more than they admit, trying to work out how to make me look stupid. I didn't realise until the 4th series that I was a patsy. You know that classically, if you don't know who the patsy is,
it's you.
It's you. Who was that?
Look, I want to have some questions from the audience here, but I've got some great ones that have been emailed or sent to us here. If your life was an episode of As Yet Untitled, what would you call it and why? I'll go to the audience, shall I?
Yeah, I'd call it There's Never Enough Painkillers.
All right, this is just, Dean, to get you into trouble. Who has been your favourite guest on QI and why? Do you remember any guests?
Well, I always like Ronnie Ancona just because I fancy her.
One more and then we'll bring a house.
Got very politically correct.
And what is your...
Rich Hall's my favourite comedian.
Who?
Rich Hall.
Ah.
We don't have him on so much these days because quite often he just puts a hat on and doesn't say anything at all. He'll say 3 brilliant things, and then after a while you think, we need someone who talks more.
And what is your favourite QI fact?
I don't remember any other facts.
You don't, not any?
My favourite one, and I said this in about 400 interviews over the last 18 years, I found out on QI that when the Vikings set out in longships and go out onto the open seas, not knowing at all what there is, it seems like an act of complete madness, knowing what we know now about how far away Newfoundland is. What they would do is they'd take birds on the ships, they'd take ravens, and they'd let the raven go, and the raven flies incredibly high. And you can see it, it's black, right? You can see it. It can't land on water. If it sees land, it will go to the land. And you can follow it. If it can't see land, it comes back to the boat. So if you just release a raven a couple of times a day, fingers crossed eventually, you do have to keep the ravens alive on the boat.
With something.
And so, I thought that was so clever, I guess, there were people in here with brains who might have worked that out for themselves, but for me, that was a complete revelation.
Viking sat-nav is pretty amazing. Yeah. Let's bring up the lights and have some thoughts and questions from the audience. Can we do that? There we go. Who would like to have a go first? Yes, lady down the front. And have we got microphones? Yeah.
Sorry, it's not a QI question, but I don't go back quite as far as Whitstable Labour Club, but Screaming Blue Murder, Hemel Hempstead, Old Town Hall, in the cellar, joke competitions and all that.
Yes.
Just wondering whether you did ever get rid of those ants in your flat.
I had ants in my flat. And I used to see an ant and think, there's an ant. All right, nice to see you. And then I'd see an ant and go, there he is again. And I'd always think it was the same ant. It never occurred to me that there were... And then one day I moved the telephone table and they were coming in under... I lived in a basement and they were coming in under the skirt. Well, yeah, I hoovered them. I did quite a long routine about ants being hoovered.
I won the joke competition on account of just saying, buy an ant pen. And
That's very good.
Big jugs, moist, big jugs, and I got big jugs for it.
I don't remember saying that. I used to ask we used to do a joke competition, and I'd ask the audience for a term of endearment for jokes they liked and a term of abuse for jokes they don't like. And that would have been that night's term of endearment, term of abuse. But we used to do, what's the difference between a famous person and a household object? And my favourite one was, what's the difference between Ted Heath and a sieve? And the one that won was, you can't fence with Ted Heath on your face.
That's pretty good. That is pretty
Some
good.
of them, I used to do Hemel Hempstead, and I used to do 2 nights a week in Birmingham. When there was a couple of lads in Birmingham, I mean, rumour had it they did go into writing comedy because they won it every week.
Brilliant. Anybody else?
Anything at all? Any discussion points?
Any
welcome.
more questions about the household of Hannah Davies? Yes, lady there. Do we have a microphone?
I could probably shout some Welsh, so I got quite a loud voice.
Yes, good. I like Welsh loud voices.
I was just wondering what it was like working with Rick Mayall on Jonathan Creek. So I know he played the detective in the wheelchair. I've just always wondered what he was like to work with.
It was a joy.
Yeah.
He was my hero, Rick. And it makes me very sad. He was my absolute hero. He was my hero when I was 16 in The Young Ones. He came on. I remember just vague little things I remember about Rick. Like, there was one time when we were in a caravans, all getting our costumes on in their little vans, and the set was about 500 yards away. It was an industrial estate. So it was a little bit too far to walk, very walkable, but and there's a car there with a driver. Should we get in the car? Yeah, fuck it, let's get in the car. And we got in the car, and Rick sat in the front, and he goes to the driver, step on it, bitch. The driver was a big fat bloke about 50. He laughed, we laughed, he made you laugh all the time. And then he did one of the scenes, he had to be in a wheelchair, and he had to learn how to work this motorised wheelchair. And you could just hear him, he drove into people. He hurt a couple of people quite badly. He was an absolute liability, and all you could hear was him going, oh, fuck, shit, sorry. And knocking over bits of the set. But we laughed and laughed and laughed. And I told him that when I was doing the National adverts, you'd get quite good people in the crew. You'd get the cameraman from Batman, or you'd get, I remember Madonna's costume or makeup woman. And the costume woman had worked with Sean Connery, and she gave me a pair of Ugg boots because it was freezing cold. And she goes, and I put them on, and she goes, you know, wore those last? And I thought, oh, I don't know. They look new, right? She goes, Sean Connery wore those last. And that's a bit of a kind of, really? Then she told me that Sean Connery, for his close-up, he perspires so much that for his close-ups, he often takes his trousers off. So if you watch him in a film, he'll probably just be in his undershorts. And I told Rick this, he just thought this was the funniest thing. So we just extrapolated that he probably had a bucket of ice and he would just be waiting for my close-up. Getting a wee bit hot now. I'm ready for my close-up. So if you're doing this scene with Rick and you went like that, he couldn't do the scene. He couldn't do the scene because he was laughing so much at the thought of Sean Connery in a bucket of ice.
Brilliant question. Yes, gentleman at the front. And are the people up the back too? I can't see too well. Stick your hand up if you can. Sure.
Me? Don't be too. This is only happening now.
What did you learn at the University of Kent? Was there anything that stuck in your mind?
Oh. Do you know what? I'll say something nice about it. The drama department, I am sure, is greatly improved. But for one term, I did classical drama in my second year, which is Aeschylus, Sophocles, Euripides, and then Aristophanes, and some of the Romans as well, Plautus, and I can't remember who else. And I didn't think it would be of interest. And Dame Shirley Barlow, who was the master of Eliot College at the time, stood in for our usual teacher, lecturer, who was on a sabbatical. And she came in and took second-year students in classical drama. She was a classicist, one of the leading classicists in the country. And she sat in front of us. I guess she was about 60 years old. And she didn't have any notes. She didn't have any photocopies. She didn't do any admin at the beginning. She would just say, so, Sophocles. It was like that. And someone would say, I didn't understand the bit where this happened. And she would say, does anyone else understand that bit? Well, I thought it was... And after 2 hours or whatever it was, if you hadn't read the plays, you felt like an idiot. You felt like you'd wasted your time. You felt like you'd missed something. It was the most compelling and fascinating teaching I had in all my time here. And it instilled in me a lifelong love of all those playwrights. And in fact, when we went to Edinburgh in 1986, we did Lysistrata by Aristophanes, and we did it as a musical. This was Pete Nattell, who's a wonderful theatre director who created the theatre company. He's in Sydney now, and he's still working as a professional theatre director. And we called it Lysistrata with an exclamation mark, as in Oklahoma. And we did, so there, that's what I learned.
Have we beaten them into submission? There must be, yes. Hello, lady at the back and the gentleman at the front.
Pass it on, pass it on, pass it on, pass it on.
With shows like Damned and Flack, you've done quite a few things that are funny but based on society and what society's like. Do you think eventually society will get to the point where actually you can't make comedy on it because it's just too unbelievable?
Do you think we may be at that point? At the moment. Well, yes, when the satire is really very good. The thing that I was proud of with Damned was that if you didn't see it, I think it's probably on 4OD or whatever their on-demand platform is. It was set in the Children's Social Services Department, and we got quite a lot of compliments from people who worked in children's social services. And so some of the storylines were really quite difficult. They managed to fill it with comedy by creating a cast of characters in the office who were ridiculous, and some of the best comic actors you could find, you know, people like Kevin Eldon. And Himesh Patel is on the side of a bus everywhere I go now because he's the lead in that film about the Beatles. And they canned us after 2 series. So I don't know what they want. No one knows what they want. John Lloyd will tell you that he's been working comedy for 40-something years. No, they don't know what they want. No one knows what they want. So as far as what the next thing in comedy is, God knows. But as far as politics goes, holy smoke. This is an actual living satire.
Does that make it... I'll come to the gentleman there in a second, but I talked to Armando Iannucci about it a little while ago during the thick of it, and he said about the thick of it, it's got to the point where it's difficult to cope with it, because how do you make it funnier than it is in real life?
Well, how can you satirise Johnson? How can you satirise... He sits there, the first time that Laura Kunsberg speaks to him when he's going to stand for she makes a few points about his complete untrustworthiness. He's actually being a liability as foreign secretary. He mentions the woman who's imprisoned in Iran. And then he makes some remark about, well, perhaps after that minestrone of observations, if I could take just a crouton from what you said. And then he goes, Laura. Fuck. And completely ignored what was being said, as he did when he went around the country with that stupid bus 3 years ago, which we seemed to be ridiculous and laughable, and then suddenly became horribly real. Then she sat down with him for an interview the other day, and her first question to him was, what would you do on your first day in office? What would you do on your first day? Well, I think it's very important to have a plan. You have to have a plan. What is this? That's what someone would say who just got off a bus. A real actual bus, not a fake lying bastard bus. Not a dog whistle to races a bus. I could go on. No one said, this is what annoyed me about it, Gavin, no one said, they just assumed that no one would vote to leave the European Union because they thought, well, everyone surely realises that being part of the biggest free market that's ever existed in human history at a time when China and Brazil and India and Russia and the United States are huge and powerful economies. Being within that free market is a much safer place than being on the outside. And being on the outside makes you what? It doesn't make you Great Britain, some mythical past. It might make you Dubai if you really make a mess of it, or the Cayman Islands. Or what do you think we're going to be like Luxembourg or Ireland and Amazon and all these people are going to come here and not pay tax but live here as well? It really is, it is nonsensical, but you could persuade people that immigration is a bad and awful thing, and it will be a bad and awful thing if there's not enough places for people to live. So if you know that 1 million people are coming, and Labour knew it, and Cameron knew it, and they all pretended they didn't know it, they knew they were coming, and they wanted them to come, because we've got an ageing population, and they wanted an imported workforce. They wanted people who are going to come here, work hard, build businesses, buy things in shops, rent houses, buy houses, and generate wealth for the country. That's what they wanted. And they got that. And those people came here. And they're all around you working. And no one said, let's make these people welcome. Let's help them if they don't understand English. Let's help them at school. Let's help them if they're struggling to get... Let's help these people because they're coming to us and they're going to enrich our country and they're going to make us richer and we're all getting old and useless and we need these people to help us. The most important thing that we have to do is we have to build houses. We've sold off all the council houses. We need to replace them because here are some people coming who won't be able to afford to buy somewhere. They are going to swamp the rental sector. The rental sector is already full of people who are on housing waiting lists. These people are on the breadline. This isn't a joke. These people who voted to leave are on the breadline in many cases. Quite often they're people who are in the lowest, poorest areas of the country. There's not enough housing, schools aren't good enough, and there's not enough job opportunities. If you're just on that poverty line, which is a line that's going up all the time, more and more people slipping under it, of course you feel as though immigration is a threat. If you're on an island, as we are, freedom of movement means invasion. If you're in Romania and Bulgaria and your parents and your grandparents grew up behind the Iron Curtain, freedom of movement means freedom to move. And when Nigel Farage went on something like Question Time and he held up his European Union passport as if it was a contemptible document and said, European Union, the first words of my passport, 508 million people have got one of these, some implication that 508 million people were going to turn up and want to live here, which would mean the entire population of Germany, the entire population of Italy and Spain. I mean, that's sort of nonsensical, idiotic, intended to scaremonger and frighten. And if you remember in 2016, there was also the Syrian Civil War, and I believe this to be the case, the first climate change civil war, because it was 4 years of crop failure that led to a civil war in that country. There was this huge scare about migration of people, of up to 1 million people coming. We would take 20,000. We still shamefully won't take enough child refugees in this country. And so people were terrified that we're being invaded. And that fear, that dog whistle to racism for people like Farage, that fear of, oh no, we're going to be swamped, we're going to be swamped. We didn't have enough houses, they wouldn't build any houses, they weren't honest about immigration, they didn't encourage us to believe that immigration's good for us, and they arrogantly held a referendum they thought they would cruise through. And then, the day after he lost, Cameron just walked out the door and went and lived in his friend's £17 million house in Holland Park. And the only thing about this that pleases me is that no one will publish his fucking book.
I will come to you in a minute. But you have just come across with a lot of facts about various things, including something which people tend to ignore, which is the climate change emergency, which helped produce population movements. And your business is in QI is fact-based, but it's funny. Do you think people actually care about the facts of immigration, the facts that people who come here tend to be younger, tend to have jobs, tend to work, tend to make money for taxes, among other things? Do you think people care about facts, Or do you think they care, actually, I feel, or people feel a certain way about foreigners, about migrants, and about the society? In other words, is it worthwhile making a factual argument, or is it just worthwhile doing what other people do in politics, which is tap into feelings?
I think Johnson's copying Trump. He's doing it quite deliberately. He's not answering the question. He's hoping that people buy into he's a lovely chap. Everyone knows he's not. He's an appalling arse. And I think that Trump's mantra day in, day out about you can't trust the news media, you can't trust the news media, which has resulted in assaults on journalists. I think you have to rely on facts. There isn't an alternative. You have to. James O'Brien's written a brilliant book, How to Be Right, a fantastic book where he's really just challenging people on basic assumptions. Assumptions are we're swamped, there is too much of this, there's too much of that, this happens, that. And he asked the 2 or 3 questions and things fall apart. There was a phrase that came up sometimes during the referendum campaign, which was, you haven't done the reading, which was one of my favourite phrases. People start to talk and you say to them, you haven't really done the reading on this, have you? You don't know what you're talking about. There were some brilliant bits where people would say, well, the EU's done nothing for us at all. And then behind them there would be a building which would say, funded by the European Union. and that cunning liberal media had pointed their camera at him with it right behind him. People in Birmingham say, well, they've done nothing for us, and there's the Symphony Hall and the Conference Centre and some other building, all partially funded by the European Union. They're completely unable to make the case based on facts. So hearsay and rumour about bananas, nonsense about the NHS. I don't know really, Gavin, what the answer is, but I think you do have to keep facts are essential and need to be more widely spread. Trouble is, there's at the moment, if you're online, there's so much that isn't true. And I like this new thing I've been reading about this week, deep fake. There's so much that isn't true. It's almost like a goldfish. It's like a fish tank. And you're looking at a fish tank, and if you imagine there's 500 fish in there, and 200 of them are fake fish, and 300 of them are factual fish, but you can't tell the difference when you're looking at the tank. You can't tell the difference. So if that's the news media, if this is the world of information that you live in, you don't really know. If you begin to not trust the news media, you are in trouble. I read an article this week saying, if Google start their own currency, we're all screwed. So I trust The Guardian, I trust The Independent, I trust The New York Times. After that, I'm struggling, to be honest with you.
That's very... during the election campaign, the European election campaign, a lady said to me, I'm going to vote for Nigel Farage. And I said, do you mind telling me why? And she said, because the European Union is totally undemocratic. And I didn't know where to begin.
No.
So I said, that's interesting, thank you. Anyway, gentleman over there.
Just wanted to ask you, because you're very involved in comedy, but you did a programme, I think it was called something like How Long's a Piece of String? About physics.
I did.
What brought you to do something factual like that?
They asked me. I made a couple of Horizon documentaries. They got a bit of stick for involving me because I was evidently some sort of gateway for a viewer who might not normally watch Horizon, some sort of conduit to, this everyman. Oh, there's a bloke from QI who understands nothing. Maybe we'll understand this Horizon if he understands it. And they did lead me through quantum physics, the single most fascinating subject, really extraordinarily interesting. And they did double their viewing figures, so they were able to stick 2 fingers up at the people who wanted Horizon kept pure and just for the scientists, because the science was correct. And we did some very interesting things about measuring a piece of string. Turns out it's impossible. Including going up to Chatham, to the rope factory in Chatham. I don't know if you've been in there. They made ropes on there for the Royal Navy, and there's a building there that's 1/4 mile long. Some of those ropes were very, very long.
It was a very big navy, wasn't it? But you remember Michael Gove's phrase that people have had enough of experts. I wonder whether, and it's a big lesson for universities, experts, because that's what universities are partly about, have to explain themselves better, and maybe, having somebody who's famous for comedy is one of the good ways of doing that. In other words, quantum physics sounds, I don't really know, I'm not sure, I'm not really going to be interested. But if you can make it approachable and interesting, then you make a case for it. Maybe those of us involved in universities need to be better at that.
Perhaps so. Perhaps so. I worry about, I've got 3 kids now. I want them to be curious. I want them to be interested. I don't want them to be watching Love Island. I really don't. And
Do you watch it?
Coming. No. Yeah.
Then how do you know how bad it is?
I could just have a sense. Mike Pence is even more dangerous than Trump, right?
The Vice President of the United States.
He's the one who talked about the theory of evolution. It's just a theory. It's only a theory. It's a proven theory, Mike. It's just a theory. It's called a theory. It's a scientific term. It's a proof. They think science on the one hand. I do have an issue with fake balance. When you feel like this happens a lot at the BBC, you've got to have a balanced argument. So you get that guy Chowdhury on all the time. 2 people think this, and 9 million people have proven this in laboratories. But we better balance it out.
Well, I used to say that, you say it's raining, I say it's not. That's not balance. One of us could go outside and have a look.
Yeah.
But that's not always what happens, is it?
Well, now, if you have the President of the United States who wants to tell you that climate change is fake because his friends in the fossil fuel business want him to say that for them, But he's now on the internet because he's got a beef with Sadiq Khan, who's a very popular, hard-working mayor of London. He wants to say that the hospitals are a sea of blood and there's endless murders. It's going to have an actual effect on our lives in London in terms of the number of visitors who want to come. It's wildly irresponsible. The murder rate in every major American city dwarfs that of London. Even New York, which actually is quite clean for murders compared to other cities, is double or triple the London murder rate. There have been a spate of killings. It's appalling. And there is no doubt at all, and Cressida Dick was saying it again today, that cuts in police funding and community policing are affecting that. So this is a result of our government's policy, not our mayor's policy. It's the ignorance and the falsehoods are actually dangerous.
But the falsehoods are dangerous in another way too, because the Washington Post says that Mr. Trump told 10,111 falsehoods in 828 days of the presidency, which is 12 a day, and that includes weekends when he's playing. So therefore, if he says, for example, it was Iran that attacked ships in the Straits of Hormuz, it was Iran who did it. Now, it may be Iran that did it, but if you have a track record of saying things which are demonstrably not true, it makes it very difficult for people to believe you when you say things which might be true. And if you're the president, that could be a problem if you start a war.
That's the first time in my life where I've seen something and actually thought, which I know a lot of people have been thinking for years, people even thought about 9/11, where I actually thought, I bet the Americans have done that. That's what I thought. Bet they've done that because they are itching for a war. You can feel it when they're itching for a war. You could just, it's in the air. You just think they want to get Iran, don't they? They're just desperate to get Iran. They've got a whole list of things they can say about Iran funding terror groups, which will give them a chance to wheel out their latest weaponry and kickstart their armaments industry, and then they'll be able to go in and clean up and rebuild it, and the whole thing. It's like that film Vice happening all over again. I was in Dubai last week doing a stand-up gig. Very odd. Wasn't entirely sure about going there for all kinds of reasons, mainly to do with human rights and gay rights and everything else that's questionable there. But I went. I found myself in a bill with 4 white men, presumably because the promoter, who was English, wouldn't dare to put on the bill that I went on the following week in Brighton, which was 1 lesbian, 1 black woman, me and Ed Byrne, and a female compere in a spangly jumpsuit. But I met a friend of mine who lives out there, and she lives a little bit up the coast and in a huge port I can't remember the name of, just north of Dubai. And her partner is the harbour master, and he told me that the value of the cargo of one of those tankers is $200 million. And
A one tanker?
A one tanker.
Wow.
It's absolutely jaw-dropping. So that boat is what is the single most valuable vessel on Earth. I mean, there's no other thing than a single thing flying or floating that's worth more. The value of what goes through the Straits of Hormuz, this is a hugely provocative act. And whoever's responsible or what combination of events, God knows, but it felt designed to provoke something. And that's why I feel it's very frightening. Well, my taxi driver brought me here tonight. It's from Afghanistan. I was talking to him about Afghanistan. See, is this going to be another part of the world that's going to be thrown into chaos with hundreds of thousands of deaths just at the whim of a lunatic? And we talk about other world leaders being lunatics. This is an actual lunatic. I mean, really, serious mental health professionals have questioned his fitness to hold any job at all. To be a barista. No offence, baristas. But you get my point.
Just got a few minutes left. One thing I
Baristas
discovered...
are walking out, Gavin. Baristas are walking out.
Yeah. Oh, look, there they go. Just a final thought. I saw that you fairly recently graduated with an MA in Creative and Life Writing from Goldsmiths. What was that about? And why did you do that? I'm interested, because you're at... Sorry, but you could be making a lot of money, and you are making a lot of money, but you could... Why would you do that? What's in it?
It was a 2-year part-time course, and I wanted to go back to college. I wanted to go back to being a student. I didn't make the most of my time here. I didn't listen a lot. I thought I knew everything. You know, normal student shit. Shirley Barlow was one of the few people who was able to handle
With Sophocles and Aristophanes.
Yeah, and I wanted to go back, but also I wanted to write about things that happened in my childhood, things that happened within my family, which I've never talked about, and I've never been able to do stand-up about. I've touched on a little bit at times, and I've written a childhood memoir, and we'll see if we can find a publisher. But I wanted to go to a place. My tutor said to me, you need to write like no one's looking over your shoulder, and you need to write the thing that makes you cry, or you need to write, we write to learn what we don't know. We don't write to set down everything that we know. We write to find out what we don't know. I didn't really understand what he meant when he said it, but by the end of the course, I completely understood what he meant. And some of the teaching there was exceptional. Some of the reading that I've done, that I've been guided towards by the teachers there, has been fascinating. So I really think it's one of the best things I've ever done. So if you're thinking about going back into education, I mean, Frank Skinner said to me years ago, he's a very intelligent guy, Frank, and he used to be a teacher. And he just said, lessons are good. Just lessons. Any lessons. It doesn't matter if you're having golf lessons, or swimming lessons, or German lessons, or coding lessons, or cooking lessons. Always be having lessons in something. And I thought that was good advice. And
just, do you think it will be published? Do you hope it will be published? Was it private? Is it something you've shown other people? Where?
I've been sending it out to people. It's intensely private, and I will publish it.
I see a contradiction there, but on that point, thank you very much.
Thank you, Gavin. Thank you very much. That time already.
That was great.
Yeah.
And thank you all for your contributions tonight, which will go to the Kent Opportunities Fund, which, as you saw at the start, is something really important for many of our students. So thank you all for coming. Thank you.
Thank you.